In the early morning hours of October 28, 1976, detectives responded to a robbery at the Western Pacific National Bank in downtown San Francisco. They found the night manager, Gary McCumber, beaten and bloodied, but alive. He told them that two men had entered the bank after closing time, attacked him, tied him up, and stole $25,000 in cash from the vault. The officers noted that he was wearing his pajamas and slippers, and that a small amount of money was scattered around the floor near where he was sitting. That's when they noticed something else. Gary had a small safe hidden under his desk, about the size of a briefcase. It was bolted down and wrapped in a heavy blanket. One of the officers tried to move it, but it didn't budge, so they cut through the ropes, pried it up, and wheeled it away for further examination. When they finally got it open, they found that the $25,000 was missing. However, the officers were surprised to find out what else was inside. The safe held some mundane things like office supplies, a framed picture of a sailboat, a bowling trophy, a couple bottles of whiskey, and a broken lamp. But most shockingly, it also contained 3 guns, an Uzi submachine gun, a Marlin rifle, and a Colt revolver, as well as several boxes of ammunition. This was more than just a bank robbery. This was a federal offense. The FBI would get involved, and they quickly discovered that the bank manager wasn't being entirely truthful, and there was a lot more going on here than just a simple robbery. What the FBI agents didn't realize at the time was that this bizarre case would lead to one of the biggest manhunts in American history. Gary had joined the bank after working for Wells Fargo for over 20 years, but he was new to this branch. His boss, Earl, was a career criminal who was running the bank with an iron fist. When Gary came aboard, he inherited a skeleton crew, only 3 other employees who were complicit in Earl's illegal activities. In addition to regular banking, they were running a gambling operation out of the basement and storing stolen property in the vault. Gary knew nothing about this and was completely caught off guard when Earl pulled him aside to explain how things were done around here. Basically, Gary was made an offer he couldn't refuse. You could say he was coerced into a criminal enterprise. Earl laid out all the rules. Gary would keep his mouth shut about everything he saw in the basement or the vault. If anyone asked, he would simply say those areas were off limits because they were being renovated. He would also do whatever he could to support their schemes. For example, if someone came in and wanted to exchange a bag of coins for bills, he would be happy to do so. Or if they needed large denominations of cash for, say, a casino marker, he would accommodate them. They started noticing discrepancies in the ledgers and reported them to his superiors, but nothing was ever done. It was then that Gary realized if he didn't play ball, he wouldn't last very long. In fact, one of his predecessors left under suspicious circumstances, allegedly jumping bail while awaiting trial on embezzlement charges. Before that, he was seen entering the bank after hours with a cardboard box and was never seen leaving. Gary assumed that the missing person was one of Earl's ways of saying "you're fired," and he was too afraid to stick around and find out. It wasn't long before Gary was sucked into the criminal underworld. He became friends with the other tellers, Earlene and Mary, and they would hang out at Mary's apartment after work, drink wine, smoke pot, and trade gossip. Soon, Gary was also participating in the gambling ring and would bring his friends from work to try their luck. At least now he felt like he was in the know and part of the team. Then one day, Earlene brought her new boyfriend, Fred, to the poker game. Gary recognized him as someone he had arrested a few years back. He was a known associate of a notorious crime family and currently on probation. Gary let it slip to the others that Fred was a known criminal, which pissed him off so much that he shoved Gary to the ground. As the fight broke out, one of the players pulled out a gun. Everyone froze as they stared at the weapon. Fred grabbed it, cocked it, and waved it around. "I'll shoot the first guy that lays a hand on me," he shouted. The fight was forgotten, and Gary was shocked by how easily Fred was able to obtain a firearm. After all, he was a convicted felon. But then he remembered that this was the same guy who walked around the bank one night and found Gary hiding in the vault. He had apparently gotten scared and stayed there for a couple of days until Gary convinced him to come out and talk to the police. Now he had a gun. Gary realized that he was in way too deep. He went to see his psychiatrist, Dr. Joyce Ladman, who he had been seeing for a year to treat his alcoholism. She was well aware that he was having problems at work and listened intently as he explained everything to her. She encouraged him to turn himself in to the authorities. With her support, he could avoid prison and become a witness in the case against his coworkers. Gary didn't follow her advice, however, and instead kept it all to himself. Then one day while at work, he made a terrible mistake. While filling out a deposit slip, he accidentally used his initials instead of the teller's initials. When his boss found out, he was summoned to the principal's office. "You think you're getting smart?" Earl yelled at him. "Do you think this is a game?" Enough was enough. Gary quit on the spot, but not before stealing $25,000 from the petty cash drawer. He was going to start a new life somewhere else, and the money would help. Placed the cash in his car and drove home. That's when the two assailants attacked him, took the money, and beat him up. As we mentioned, when the police arrived, they found Gary bound and gagged but still conscious. He told them everything that happened, including the robbery. But he didn't mention anything about the gambling ring or the other crimes taking place at the bank. He was embarrassed and ashamed and didn't want to admit that he was involved in such shady dealings. The officers searched the bank and found nothing unusual except for the small safe in Gary's office. What they didn't realize was that Gary had actually concealed the safe with a false bottom. It wasn't bolted down and moved easily on wheels. He had hidden the safe there to protect the evidence from both the police and his bosses. Unfortunately for Gary, the second group got to it before the first. At this point, the FBI was called in since the firearms had been involved. They dug deeper into Gary's background and found out he had stolen $12,000 from Wells Fargo in 1973 and was awaiting trial for embezzling $10,000 from his previous employer. The feds also uncovered the true identity of the two robbers. They weren't just common thugs hired by Earl to take care of Gary. They were brothers. Michael and Donald DeGilia. Donald had been released from prison just 2 weeks earlier after serving 6 years for armed robbery. Michael was also a career criminal with 20 prior arrests, including 11 for armed robbery. In 1973, he served 18 months in state prison for assault with a deadly weapon. In 1974, he was sentenced to 5 years for bank robbery, and in 1975, he was given 4 more years for another bank robbery. His record was so extensive that he had earned the nickname Lefty, due to the number of times he had to sign his name while committing crimes. But as far as the FBI was concerned, the main suspect in the case was Fred. They tracked him back to Louisiana, where he was picked up by local police after trying to cash a forged check. When they searched him, they found a loaded pistol and some burglary tools. A search of his motel room turned up another weapon and several items that had been stolen during a recent burglary in Mississippi. Fred was returned to San Francisco, where he was questioned about the robbery. But just as the FBI was about to close in on him, he disappeared. They caught up to him again in New Orleans, but he escaped from custody after telling the cops that he had to use the restroom. Somehow he avoided capture again, but not before leaving behind a bloody shoe that matched the footprints at the scene of the crime. By this time, Fred's girlfriend, Earlene, had become a material witness in the case, but she too had disappeared. The FBI found her abandoned car at the airport, but there was no sign of her. They interviewed her roommate, Mary, who claimed to have seen her leave town with Fred. But in reality, she had run away with the getaway driver, Henry Hill. Henry was the son of mobster Alphonse Hill, who was in prison for narcotics trafficking. He was also wanted for questioning in connection with a murder in Miami. The gang was now starting to fall apart, and the FBI was ready to bring them all to justice. They tracked Fred down in Phoenix, Arizona, where he was living under the alias Frank DeRosia. He had dyed his hair brown to cover up his distinctive red hair. But when the FBI showed him the bloody shoe, he broke down and confessed. He was extradited back to California, where he pleaded guilty to robbery and was sentenced to 10 years in prison. However, the others weren't so cooperative. Donald and Michael DeGilia refused to speak to the authorities and were never charged. Their brother Joseph and mother Helen were also questioned, but no charges were filed against them either. Meanwhile, Arlene and Mary were never found. Where are they now? Gary died in 1995 from complications of diabetes. Earl Hill died in 2002. Alphonse Hill died in 2009, and that's why you should subscribe for more.